The morning sun cast long shadows across Terminal B at Denver International Airport, as hundreds of travelers hurried through the security checkpoint. Among them walked a young woman in her mid-20s, her hands trembling slightly as she approached the metal detector. Sarah Martinez had never imagined this day would come, but here she was, carrying the most precious cargo of her life. In her carry-on bag, wrapped carefully in an American flag, rested the cremated remains of her brother, Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez. He had been killed in action just 2 weeks earlier, while serving his third tour of duty overseas. The military had finally released his remains to the family, and Sarah was bringing him home to their small town in Colorado for burial. The TSA agent, a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes named Robert Thompson, had been working airport security for over 15 years. He had seen everything from suspicious packages to emotional breakdowns, but something about the young woman approaching his station caught his attention. She moved differently than other passengers, with a careful, reverent step that spoke of someone carrying something incredibly important. When Sarah placed her bag on the conveyor belt, she took a deep breath and approached Agent Thompson. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she explained what she was carrying. The words came out in broken sentences, her grief still too fresh and raw. She showed him the official military documentation that identified the contents of the small wooden box inside her bag. Agent Thompson's expression immediately softened. He had served in the military himself many years ago and understood the weight of what this young woman was going through. However, protocol was protocol, and he knew that cremated remains, even those of fallen soldiers, required additional screening procedures. The box would need to be opened and inspected, just like any other item passing through security. As Sarah's bag emerged from the X-ray machine, the other TSA agents gathered around the screen. The distinctive shape of the cremation urn was clearly visible, along with the folded flag that surrounded it. Agent Thompson called for his supervisor, a stern woman named Janet Collins, who had been with the TSA since its inception after September 11th. Supervisor Collins reviewed the documentation and confirmed what Agent Thompson already knew. Despite the sacred nature of the contents, security protocols required that the container be opened for visual inspection. There were no exceptions, even for fallen heroes. The rules existed for everyone's safety, and they had to be followed regardless of the circumstances. Sarah's face went pale when she heard the news. The thought of strangers opening her brother's final resting place felt like a violation of everything he had died protecting. She tried to explain that Miguel had given his life for his country, that he deserved respect and dignity even in death. Her voice began to rise as emotion overcame her carefully maintained composure. Other passengers in line began to notice the commotion. A businessman checking his watch impatiently stepped closer to see what was causing the delay. Behind him, a family with young children strained to understand why the line had suddenly stopped moving. The word soldier began to circulate through the crowd in hushed whispers. Agent Thompson found himself in an impossible position. His heart went out to the grieving sister, but he had sworn an oath to uphold security procedures without exception. He had seen too many tragic consequences when rules were bent or broken, even with the best of intentions. The safety of hundreds of passengers depended on his ability to do his job properly, regardless of his personal feelings. The supervisor made the decision that would soon spark outrage throughout the terminal. She instructed Agent Thompson to proceed with the inspection, emphasizing that national security could not be compromised for anyone, regardless of their sacrifice or service. The cremation container would need to be opened, examined and tested for explosive residue, just like any other potentially suspicious item. As news of the situation spread through the security line, more passengers began to pay attention. A Vietnam veteran named Frank Morrison, traveling with his wife to visit their grandchildren, overheard the conversation and immediately understood what was happening. His own memories of returning from war to an ungrateful nation came flooding back, and he felt his blood pressure rising. Near the back of the line, a young mother named Lisa Chen was traveling with her infant daughter when she heard someone mention that airport security was refusing to let a soldier's remains pass through without being opened and inspected. She couldn't believe what she was hearing and moved closer to see if the rumors were true. The tension in the security area was becoming palpable. Agent Thompson could feel the eyes of dozens of passengers boring into him as he reluctantly prepared to follow his supervisor's orders. He looked at Sarah's tear-filled eyes and saw not just grief, but a deep sense of betrayal by the very system her brother had died defending. Sarah made one final plea, her voice breaking as she begged them to reconsider. She explained that Miguel had been just 24 years old when he died, that he had joined the military to serve his country and protect the freedoms that everyone in the airport took for granted. She asked how they could justify desecrating his remains in the name of the very security he had died to protect. The crowd of onlookers continued to grow as word spread through the terminal. Passengers who had already cleared security were returning to see what was happening. Airport staff members began to gather at a respectful distance, unsure of how to handle the increasingly volatile situation. The normal bustle of the busy airport seemed to fade into the background as everyone focused on the drama unfolding at the security checkpoint. Agent Thompson's hand shook slightly as he reached for the wooden container. He knew that once he opened it, there would be no going back. The decision would define not just this moment, but potentially his entire career and reputation. He could feel the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on him as he prepared to follow the orders that his training and regulations demanded, even though every fiber of his being screamed that this was wrong. The silence that fell over the security checkpoint was deafening. Agent Thompson's hands hovered over the wooden container containing Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez's remains, while his supervisor, Janet Collins, stood firm in her decision. The weight of protocol pressed down on everyone involved, but the human cost of that protocol was becoming increasingly clear to the growing crowd of witnesses. Frank Morrison, the Vietnam veteran who had been watching from the line, could no longer contain himself. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "This is exactly what we fought against," he said, his words carrying the authority of someone who had seen too much war and too little respect for those who served. "This young man died for our freedom, and you're treating him like a common criminal." His wife, Eleanor, tried to pull him back, worried that his involvement might make things worse. But Frank had seen too many fellow soldiers dishonored over the years to stand quietly by. He moved closer to Sarah, positioning himself between her and the TSA agents as a show of solidarity. His presence seemed to give other passengers permission to voice their own objections. Lisa Chen, the young mother with the infant, spoke up from her position in line. "How can you do this to a family that's already suffering?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "This woman just lost her brother. Haven't they sacrificed enough?" Her baby, sensing the tension in her mother's voice, began to fuss, adding another layer of emotion to the already charged atmosphere. Agent Thompson looked around at the faces surrounding him. He saw anger, disappointment, and disbelief in the eyes of passengers who had trusted him to protect them while treating them with dignity. The very people he was supposed to serve were now looking at him as if he were the enemy. The irony wasn't lost on him that in following rules designed to protect these passengers, he was alienating them completely. Supervisor Collins remained unmoved by the growing opposition. She had dealt with difficult situations before, and had learned that public pressure could never be allowed to override security protocols. "I understand everyone's emotions," she announced to the crowd, "but the safety of all passengers must come first. These procedures exist for a reason, and they apply to everyone without exception." Her words only seemed to fuel the fire. A businessman who had been impatiently checking his watch earlier now found himself defending the delay he had been annoyed about moments before. "Some things are more important than schedules," he said, surprising himself with his own words. "This is about basic human decency." Sarah watched the scene unfolding around her with a mixture of gratitude and horror. She was grateful that strangers were standing up for her brother's honor, but horrified that his final journey home was becoming a public spectacle. All she wanted was to bring Miguel home quietly and with dignity, but instead, she found herself at the center of a confrontation that seemed to be growing by the minute. The crowd continued to swell as passengers from other security lines began to migrate toward the commotion. Airport security guards started to appear at the edges of the crowd, their presence adding an ominous undertone to the already tense situation. The normal flow of the airport had essentially stopped as everyone's attention focused on the small wooden box that contained a young soldier's remains. A teenage girl traveling with her school group whispered to her friend, "My cousin died in Afghanistan last year. If someone did this to his ashes, my family would never forgive them." Her comment was overheard by others, who began sharing their own connections to military service. It seemed that almost everyone in the crowd had been touched by military service in some way, whether through their own experience or that of family members and friends. Agent Thompson could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. He had never imagined that following standard procedures could feel so wrong. Every instinct he had developed over 15 years of security work told him to follow the rules. But every moral fiber in his body told him that this situation was different. This wasn't about catching terrorists or preventing tragedy. This was about a sister trying to bring her brother home. The pressure from both sides was becoming unbearable. His supervisor expected him to follow orders without question, while the crowd expected him to show basic human compassion. He found himself caught between his duty to his job and his duty to his conscience, with dozens of people watching to see which would win out. As the standoff continued, a news crew that had been covering a different story in the airport caught wind of the situation. The reporter, Amanda Walsh, quickly recognized the potential impact of the story unfolding before her. She and her cameraman began setting up at a discreet distance, capturing the raw emotion on both sides of the conflict. The arrival of the news crew seemed to raise the stakes even higher. What had begun as a simple security procedure was now on its way to becoming a national story. Agent Thompson realized that his decision would soon be scrutinized, not just by the passengers around him, but by viewers across the country. The thought made his stomach turn. Supervisor Collins noticed the news crew and immediately became more rigid in her stance. She couldn't be seen backing down from established procedures on camera, as it might encourage others to challenge security protocols in the future. She radioed for additional support, requesting that airport police be placed on standby in case the situation escalated further. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the attention her private grief had attracted. She looked down at the bag containing her brother's remains and whispered a quiet apology. This wasn't how she had imagined bringing him home. Instead of a quiet, dignified journey, Miguel was once again at the center of a conflict, just as he had been during his 3 tours of duty overseas. The crowd's anger was becoming more focused and vocal. Passengers began chanting, "Let him through and honor our heroes," their voices echoing through the terminal. Other travelers throughout the airport were beginning to notice the commotion, and many were making their way toward the security checkpoint to see what was happening. Agent Thompson made a decision that would change everything. He looked at his supervisor, then at Sarah, then at the crowd of angry passengers. In that moment, he realized that some things were indeed more important than following orders blindly. He took a step back from the container and removed his hands from it entirely. Agent Thompson's decision to step away from the container sent shockwaves through both the crowd and his fellow TSA agents. Supervisor Collins immediately moved toward him, her face flushed with anger and disbelief. "Agent Thompson, return to your position immediately," she commanded, her voice sharp enough to cut through the growing noise of the crowd. "You will follow protocol, or you will face disciplinary action." The veteran TSA agent looked at his supervisor with 15 years of loyalty and service reflected in his eyes. But something had fundamentally changed in the last few minutes. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I cannot in good conscience open the remains of a fallen soldier in front of his grieving sister and a crowd of witnesses," he said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "Some things are more important than regulations." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, their approval washing over Agent Thompson like a wave of validation. Frank Morrison stepped forward and placed a weathered hand on the agent's shoulder. "Son, you just did something that takes real courage," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his own military experience. That young man would be proud to know someone stood up for him. Sarah Martinez felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time since arriving at the airport, they weren't tears of despair. She looked at Agent Thompson with profound gratitude, seeing in him the kind of honor and integrity that her brother had always displayed. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the noise of the crowd. "Miguel would have appreciated your respect." Supervisor Collins found herself in an impossible position. Her agent was openly defying direct orders in front of a growing crowd of witnesses and news cameras. Every protocol manual said she should immediately remove him from duty and proceed with the inspection herself. But the crowd's reaction made it clear that such action would likely provoke an even stronger response. She could see airport police gathering at the edges of the scene, waiting for her signal. The news reporter Amanda Walsh was capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. She recognized that this story had the potential to spark a national conversation about the balance between security and human dignity. Her cameraman focused on the faces of the crowd, capturing the raw emotion and genuine anger that had brought these strangers together in defense of a fallen soldier. Lisa Chen, still holding her infant daughter, felt compelled to add her voice to the growing chorus of support. "I'm not even American," she called out, her accent revealing her Chinese heritage. "But I know that honoring those who died for their country should be universal. This is wrong, and everyone here knows it." Her words seemed to resonate particularly strongly with the crowd. Here was someone from another culture, someone who had no obligation to care about American military traditions, and even she could see the injustice in the situation. The message was clear. Basic human decency transcended nationality and cultural boundaries. A group of college students who had been traveling together began using their smartphones to broadcast the scene live on social media. Within minutes, hashtags like "Honor Our Heroes" and "Can Respect the Remnants" were trending on multiple platforms. The story was spreading beyond the confines of the airport at lightning speed, reaching people across the country who had never heard of Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez, but were outraged by his treatment. Agent Thompson could feel the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. He knew that his career with the TSA was likely over, but he also knew that he would be able to look at himself in the mirror for the rest of his life. Some principles were worth the sacrifice, and the dignity of fallen soldiers was certainly one of them. Supervisor Collins made a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. She announced over the terminal's public address system that the security checkpoint would be temporarily closed due to an operational issue. She hoped that dispersing the crowd might defuse the tension and allow her to deal with the situation more quietly. Her plan backfired spectacularly. Instead of dispersing, passengers from throughout the terminal began converging on the closed checkpoint. Word was spreading that airport security was disrespecting a fallen soldier, and people were coming to see for themselves and add their voices to the protest. What had started as a small crowd was becoming a significant gathering of outraged citizens. A retired Air Force colonel named James Patterson pushed through the crowd when he heard what was happening. He was still wearing his military ID bracelet and moved with the unmistakable bearing of a career officer. When he reached the front of the crowd and saw the situation for himself, his face darkened with anger. "This is absolutely unacceptable," Colonel Patterson announced, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of military service. "I've seen combat in 3 different wars, and I've never witnessed such disrespect for a fallen comrade. This young man died wearing the uniform of the United States Army, and his remains deserve to be treated with the highest honor." His words carried additional weight due to his obvious military bearing and the respect he commanded from both the crowd and even some of the airport security personnel. Several other veterans in the crowd began identifying themselves, creating an impromptu coalition of military voices, all speaking with one clear message: this treatment was unacceptable. The situation was spiraling, beyond anything Supervisor Collins had ever dealt with in her career. She realized that she needed to contact her regional director immediately, as this was no longer a local security issue but a potential public relations disaster for the entire Transportation Security Administration. The last thing the TSA needed was to be seen as disrespecting fallen soldiers on national television. Agent Thompson used the temporary chaos to approach Sarah Martinez directly. "Miss, I want you to know that regardless of what happens to me, your brother served with honor, and he deserves to be treated with honor," he said quietly. "I may lose my job over this, but some things are worth more than employment." Sarah looked at this stranger who was willing to sacrifice his career for her brother's dignity and felt a restoration of faith in humanity that she hadn't experienced since Miguel's death. "He would have done the same thing you're doing," she told him. "He always stood up for what was right even when it cost him." The crowd had grown to several hundred people, with more arriving every minute. Airport operations were beginning to be seriously affected, as other security checkpoints became overwhelmed with passengers diverted from the closed checkpoint. The economic impact of the delay was mounting, but nobody in the crowd seemed to care about schedules or missed connections anymore. Frank Morrison took it upon himself to address the crowd, his voice carrying over the noise as he called for their attention. "Folks, we're here because we all understand that some things are sacred," he began. The remains of our fallen soldiers are sacred. The promises we make to the families of those who gave everything for our freedom are sacred. And the basic human decency that separates us from our enemies is sacred too. His impromptu speech was met with thunderous applause and chants of agreement. The crowd was becoming more organized and more determined, transforming from a random group of angry passengers into a focused movement with a clear purpose. The arrival of airport police only seemed to intensify the crowd's determination rather than disperse it. Officer Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran of airport security, found herself facing a situation unlike any she had encountered in her career. The crowd wasn't violent or destructive. They were simply united in their belief that a fundamental injustice was taking place before their eyes. As the senior police officer on scene, Santos had to make a crucial decision about how to handle the growing protest. She could see that any attempt to forcibly remove the crowd would likely result in arrests, injuries, and a media nightmare that would reflect poorly on everyone involved. Instead, she chose to position her officers as peacekeepers rather than enforcers, hoping to maintain order while allowing the situation to resolve itself. Meanwhile, Supervisor Collins was engaged in an increasingly frantic phone conversation with TSA regional headquarters. Her superiors were watching the live news coverage and social media feeds with growing alarm as the story spread across the internet. What had begun as a routine security procedure was rapidly becoming a national incident that threatened to damage the agency's reputation permanently. The college students who had been live streaming the event were providing real-time commentary that was being shared thousands of times across multiple platforms, their generation's natural facility. With social media was turning a local airport incident into a viral sensation that was reaching millions of people within hours. "This is insane," one of the students said into her phone's camera. "They literally want to open up a dead soldier's ashes to check for bombs. Like, seriously? This guy died fighting terrorists and now they want to treat him like he might be one. It's completely backwards." Her live stream was being shared by followers who shared it with their own networks, creating an exponential spread of outrage that was reaching far beyond the airport. Comments were pouring in from viewers across the country, with overwhelming support for Agent Thompson's stand and condemnation of the TSA's inflexibility. Colonel Patterson had taken it upon himself to provide some leadership to the growing crowd of veterans and civilians. His military background gave him a natural ability to organize people and communicate clearly under pressure. He approached Sarah Martinez to ensure that she was comfortable with the attention her situation was receiving. "Miss Martinez, I want you to know that none of us here are trying to exploit your grief," he said respectfully. "We're here because your brother represents every son and daughter who made the ultimate sacrifice for our country. The way he's being treated reflects on how we treat all of our fallen heroes." Sarah nodded, wiping away fresh tears. She had been overwhelmed by the support from complete strangers, people who had never met Miguel but were willing to stand up for his honor. "I just wanted to bring him home quietly," she said. "But maybe this is how it's supposed to happen. Maybe people need to see what's wrong with this system." The news reporter Amanda Walsh was conducting impromptu interviews with members of the crowd, capturing their personal stories and connections to military service. Nearly everyone she spoke with had some tie to the armed forces, whether through their own service, family members, or friends who had served. The interviews revealed a deep well of frustration with how veterans and their families were often treated by bureaucratic institutions. "My son served 2 tours in Iraq," one elderly woman told the camera, her voice shaking with emotion. "He came home with PTSD and had to fight for months just to get the help he needed from the VA. Now they want to disrespect the dead too? When does it end?" Agent Thompson had been standing quietly near the security checkpoint, still refusing to follow his supervisor's orders, despite increasing pressure. Other TSA agents were watching him with a mixture of admiration and concern, knowing that his career was likely over, but understanding why he had made his choice. His colleague, Agent Jennifer Park, approached him during a brief lull in the chaos. "Robert, you know they're going to fire you for this," she said quietly. "Are you sure this is worth throwing away 15 years of service?" Agent Thompson looked at his friend and fellow agent with sadness but also with conviction. "Jen, if following the rules means I have to desecrate the remains of a soldier who died for our freedom, then maybe these aren't rules worth following," he replied. "I'd rather be unemployed than be someone who can't tell the difference between right and wrong." The crowd had begun organizing itself into a more formal protest. Veterans were identifying themselves with improvised signs, and someone had started leading patriotic songs that echoed through the terminal. The atmosphere was becoming almost festive, despite the serious nature of the underlying issue. Lisa Chen found herself at the center of a group of mothers who were discussing how they would want their own children treated if they died in military service. The conversation was emotionally charged, with several women breaking down as they imagined themselves in Sarah Martinez's position. "I have a son who's thinking about joining the Marines," one mother said through tears. "The thought that this could happen to him, that bureaucrats could treat his remains like cargo, it makes me want to tell him not to serve. How can we ask our children to die for a country that won't even respect them in death?" The economic impact of the protest was becoming significant. 3 security checkpoints were now backed up due to the closure of Checkpoint B, and dozens of flights were experiencing delays. Airport management was under increasing pressure to resolve the situation, but they were also aware that any heavy-handed tactics would likely make the situation worse. Supervisor Collins received a phone call that would change everything. The call was from the TSA administrator himself, who had been watching the news coverage from Washington. His message was clear: find a way to resolve the situation immediately, and do whatever was necessary to avoid further damage to the agency's reputation. "Collins, I don't care what the manual says," the administrator said bluntly. "This is a public relations disaster that's getting worse by the minute. Use your discretion and make this go away, but do it in a way that shows respect for the fallen soldier and his family." The supervisor found herself with the authority she needed to make an exception, but she also knew that backing down now would appear weak and could set a precedent for future challenges to security protocols. She was caught between competing pressures from above and below, with the eyes of the nation watching her every move. Frank Morrison noticed Supervisor Collins ending her phone call and approached her with Colonel Patterson at his side. The 2 veterans had decided to try a diplomatic approach, hoping to find a solution that would allow everyone to save face while doing right by Staff Sergeant Martinez. "Ma'am, we understand you have a difficult job to do," Morrison began respectfully, "but we also believe there has to be a way to ensure security without dishonoring our fallen heroes. Is there any procedure that would allow these remains to pass through without being opened?" Colonel Patterson added his voice to the appeal. "Supervisor, I've worked with TSA officials many times during my military career, and I know that your people generally have great respect for the military. Surely there's a way to verify the contents of this container without the indignity of opening it in public." Supervisor Collins looked at the 2 veterans, then at the crowd of hundreds of people watching her every move, then at the news cameras that were broadcasting her decision to the entire country. She realized that this moment would define not just her career, but possibly the TSA's relationship with military families for years to come. Supervisor Collins stood at the crossroads of her career, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. The phone call from Washington had given her the authority to make an exception, but years of rigid adherence to protocol made the decision feel almost impossible. She looked at Sarah Martinez, who was clutching her brother's military documentation with trembling hands, and for the first time saw past the procedures to the human being who was suffering. "Agent Thompson," she called out, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. The veteran TSA agent turned toward her, expecting to be formally relieved of duty. Instead, he saw something in his supervisor's expression that he hadn't seen before, a crack in the rigid facade that had defined her approach to security work. "Agent Thompson, you will escort Miss Martinez and her brother's remains through security with full honors," Collins announced, her voice carrying clearly across the terminal. "The United States Transportation Security Administration recognizes the sacrifice of Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez and will ensure his final journey home is conducted with the dignity and respect he earned through his service to our nation." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause that echoed through the entire terminal. Passengers who had been watching from distant gates could hear the celebration and began making their way toward the security checkpoint to see what had caused such an outburst of joy. The sound was unlike anything the airport had ever experienced, spontaneous, genuine, and deeply emotional. Sarah Martinez collapsed into tears of relief and gratitude. The stress and grief of the past 2 weeks, combined with the fear that her brother would be dishonored in death, suddenly released in a flood of emotion that left her barely able to stand. Lisa Chen, the young mother who had been one of the first to speak up, immediately went to Sarah's side to offer comfort and support. Agent Thompson felt a rush of emotions he hadn't experienced since his own military service decades earlier. The validation from the crowd, the gratitude from Sarah, and most importantly, the knowledge that he had done the right thing regardless of the personal cost, filled him with a sense of purpose he had nearly forgotten. He approached Sarah with the formal bearing of a soldier honoring a fallen comrade. "Miss Martinez, it would be my honor to personally ensure your brother's safe passage through security," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Staff Sergeant Martinez served our country with distinction, and he will be treated with the respect he deserves." Colonel Patterson stepped forward and offered to escort Sarah and Agent Thompson through the security process as a representative of the military community. His presence would add an additional layer of dignity to the proceedings and ensure that proper military honors were observed. The crowd began forming an informal honor guard, with veterans positioning themselves along the path to the gates. Frank Morrison organized the veterans in the crowd into two lines, creating a corridor of honor for Sarah and her brother's remains to pass through. Each veteran stood at attention as the small procession moved through the security checkpoint, many with tears in their eyes as they remembered their own fallen comrades and the families left behind. The news cameras captured every moment of the ceremony, broadcasting images of ordinary citizens coming together to honor a fallen soldier. Amanda Walsh provided commentary that captured the significance of the moment, explaining how a routine security procedure had transformed into a powerful demonstration of respect for military service and sacrifice. As Sarah walked through the impromptu honor guard, strangers reached out to touch her arm or offer quiet words of comfort. Many shared their own connections to military service, telling brief stories of sons, daughters, spouses, and friends who had served or made the ultimate sacrifice. The terminal had become a temporary memorial to all fallen heroes, not just Staff Sergeant Martinez. The college students who had been live streaming the event were now broadcasting what had become a ceremony of national significance. Their social media feeds were exploding with shares, comments, and messages of support from viewers across the country who had been following the story. The hashtags they had started were now being used by major news outlets and politicians commenting on the situation. Agent Thompson escorted Sarah to the gate where her connecting flight was boarding. But the journey through the terminal became much more than a simple walk. Airport employees along the route had heard about what was happening and lined the corridors to pay their respects. Pilots, flight attendants, baggage handlers, and maintenance workers all paused in their duties to honor the fallen soldier. When they reached the gate, the airline captain was waiting to personally welcome Sarah aboard. Captain Rodriguez was himself a veteran who had served in the Navy before becoming a commercial pilot. He informed Sarah that the airline would be upgrading her to first class and that he would make a special announcement about Staff Sergeant Martinez. "During the flight, your brother will have an escort of honor all the way home," Captain Rodriguez told Sarah. "And when we land, I'll make sure the local honor guard is there to receive him properly." Supervisor Collins watched the procession from the security checkpoint. Her own emotions conflicted but ultimately settled. She knew that she had made the right decision, even if it meant potentially facing questions from headquarters about her deviation from protocol. The human element of their work, the reason security existed in the first place, had been served. The crowd began to disperse gradually, but many passengers stayed to watch Sarah board her flight. The terminal slowly returned to its normal operations, but there was a different feeling in the air. Strangers were talking to each other about what they had witnessed, sharing stories and perspectives that normally would never have been exchanged. Agent Thompson returned to his post, uncertain about what the future held for his career, but certain that he had acted with integrity. His fellow TSA agents looked at him with newfound respect, and several approached him privately to express their support for his actions. The rigid culture of rule following had been challenged, and many found themselves questioning whether blind adherence to protocol was always the right approach. The story was being picked up by national news outlets within hours of the resolution. Politicians from both parties issued statements praising the eventual outcome, while calling for a review of TSA procedures regarding military remains. Veterans organizations announced their support for Agent Thompson, and their appreciation for how the situation was ultimately handled. Social media was flooded with messages of support for Sarah Martinez and condolences for her family's loss. Complete strangers shared their own military experiences and stories of loss, creating a virtual community of support that extended far beyond the physical boundaries of the airport. The hashtag Staff Sergeant Martinez became a rallying point for discussions about how society treats its veterans and their families. As Sarah's flight taxied toward the runway, she looked out the window at the airport terminal where so many strangers had come together to defend her brother's honor. She realized that Miguel's final journey home had become something much larger than a simple flight. It had become a reminder of the values he had died defending and the community of Americans who still believed in honoring those values. The plane lifted off into the Colorado sky, carrying Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez toward his final resting place. But his story, and the story of the ordinary citizens who stood up for his dignity, would continue to resonate long after the flight landed and the crowds dispersed. 6 months after the incident at Denver International Airport, the ripple effects of that emotional day continued to spread across the country in ways that nobody could have predicted. What had begun as a confrontation between security protocols and human dignity had evolved into a national conversation about how America treats its veterans and their families, both in life and in death. Agent Robert Thompson found himself at the center of that conversation, though not in the way he had expected. Rather than being fired for insubordination, he had been promoted to a new position within the TSA as a liaison for military families and veterans affairs. His willingness to put conscience above protocol had impressed his superiors in Washington, who recognized that the agency needed people who could balance security concerns with human compassion. The new position allowed Thompson to travel across the country, training TSA agents on how to handle situations involving military remains and veterans issues with appropriate sensitivity. His story had become a teaching tool, demonstrating that good judgment sometimes required the courage to question established procedures when they conflicted with fundamental values. Sarah Martinez had returned to her small Colorado town to bury her brother with full military honors, but her life had been forever changed by the experience at the airport. The outpouring of support from strangers had helped her process her grief in ways she never anticipated. She had started a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting military families during their most difficult moments, providing advocacy and assistance when they encountered bureaucratic obstacles. The organization, which she named the Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez Foundation, had already helped dozens of families navigate complex military and civilian bureaucracies. Sarah had discovered that her brother's story resonated with people who had faced their own struggles with inflexible systems that seemed to forget the human element of their work. Colonel James Patterson had become one of the Foundation's most active board members, using his military connections and leadership experience to expand its reach. The retired Air Force officer had been deeply moved by the unity he witnessed at the airport and wanted to ensure that other families would not face the same challenges that Sarah had endured. Frank Morrison, the Vietnam veteran who had been one of the first to speak up in the crowd, had found new purpose in his retirement. He had started volunteering at the local VA hospital, helping younger veterans navigate the complex systems they encountered when seeking benefits and medical care. His experience at the airport had reminded him that every generation of veterans faced challenges in receiving the respect and support they had earned. The news reporter, Amanda Walsh, had won a Peabody Award for her coverage of the incident, but more importantly to her, the story had opened doors to cover other issues affecting veterans and military families. She had spent months investigating problems within the VA system, TSA procedures, and other government agencies that interacted with military families. Her reporting had led to several policy changes and increased oversight of these agencies. Lisa Chen, the young mother who had spoken up despite being an immigrant with no military connections, had become an American citizen partly inspired by what she witnessed at the airport. The experience had shown her the best of American values, the willingness of ordinary people to stand up for what was right, regardless of personal cost. She had become active in veterans organizations in her community, proving that respect for military service transcended cultural and national boundaries. Supervisor Janet Collins had retired early from the TSA, but not in disgrace as she had initially feared. Her willingness to reverse her initial decision and show flexibility when the situation demanded it had actually enhanced her reputation within the agency. She had consulted on policy revisions, that gave supervisors more discretion in handling sensitive situations involving military remains and other ceremonial items. The incident had prompted a comprehensive review of TSA procedures regarding military remains and veterans issues. The new guidelines provided clearer protocols for handling such situations while maintaining security standards. Agents received additional training on recognizing and appropriately responding to military-related items and situations, with an emphasis on balancing security needs with respect for service and sacrifice. Denver International Airport had installed a permanent memorial honoring fallen service members, with Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez's name prominently displayed. The memorial had become a place where travelers could pause to reflect on the sacrifices made by military personnel and their families. It served as a reminder that airports were not just transit points, but places where significant human dramas unfolded. Daily, the college students, who had live-streamed the original incident, had graduated and gone on to careers in journalism and social media, but they credited that day with teaching them about the power of citizen journalism and grassroots organizing. Their coverage had demonstrated how ordinary people with smartphones could bring national attention to important issues and create momentum for positive change. The story continued to be shared on social media, particularly around military holidays and during times when veterans' issues were in the news. It had become a touchstone for discussions about how institutions should balance rules with human compassion, and how ordinary citizens could make a difference when they witnessed injustice. Airport employees across the country reported that the story had changed how they approached their work, particularly when dealing with families in distress or situations that involved military service. The incident had humanized their work in ways that training manuals and policy documents never could, reminding them that behind every passenger was a person with their own story and struggles. Military families traveling through airports often mentioned the story to TSA agents and airline personnel, citing it as an example of the respect they hoped to receive. The incident had raised awareness about the unique challenges faced by military families and had created a greater sensitivity to their needs among transportation workers. The annual memorial service for staff, Sergeant Miguel Martinez in his hometown had grown from a small family gathering to a community event that drew hundreds of attendees, including many who had never met him, but had been moved by his story. The service had become a focal point for discussions about military service, sacrifice, and the obligations of a grateful nation to its veterans. Agent Thompson often spoke at these memorial services and other veterans events, sharing his perspective on the importance of maintaining humanity within bureaucratic systems. His message was always the same. Rules and procedures were important, but they should serve people, not the other way around. When protocols conflicted with fundamental human dignity, it was the duty of every public servant to find a better way. The long-term impact of that day at Denver International Airport continued to unfold in ways both large and small. Policy changes, career shifts, new organizations, and countless individual acts of kindness and respect could all be traced back to the moment when ordinary citizens decided that some things were too important to leave to bureaucratic procedures. The story had become proof that regular people, when moved by conscience and united by common values, could create change that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez had given his life in service to his country, but his final journey home had given something back to the nation he served, a reminder that honor, dignity, and respect were not just military values, but American values that required constant vigilance and active protection by every citizen.